Okay, well, I think that we will kick off. We've got quite a few people still coming in from the waiting room, so we'll do a little bit of welcoming and acknowledging. So I'm Nairi Kerse. I'm the Joyce Cook Chair of Aging Well up here at the University of Auckland, and I'm also the President of the New Zealand Association of Gerontology. This session is a combined effort with the Age Concern New Zealand and the New Zealand Association of Gerontology. We're excited to be presenting this webinar series in replacement for our in-person conference, which is now postponed until next year. If you want to put it in your diaries now, October the 1st, 2021 will be our Age Concern New Zealand Association of Gerontology combined conference. So I'd like to welcome everybody here. I'd like to thank our sponsors, who is Ryman Healthcare. They're our gold sponsor. And today we'll be having two speakers who will speak for half an hour each. And then we will be having breakout rooms, which is an opportunity for you as the participants to gather together and talk to each other about the presentations. We've got a couple of key questions, which we'll, if we have time, pose to the speakers, and then ask you to discuss those questions and anything else that's likely to come up. So I just see there's still quite a few people coming in, so we'll just give it 1 or 2 more minutes. New Zealand Association of Gerontology is an association of people interested in issues for older people, most interested in educational training, academic research, areas of practice. We have a vibrant student group who will, and there's actually a student event coming up on the 29th in the same webinar series. And so I'd really encourage you to, if you are a student, to have a look at that and join us for that event. The next webinar next week is going to be a very popular one because we have Ashley Bloomfield, who will join us in a panel to talk about the issues facing older people post-COVID and how things have gone. It's called Taking a Breath. So now we've filled in another minute. We're just 4 minutes after, so I think we'll start. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who's Vanessa Berholt. She'll speak for about half an hour, and then we have Dr. Macarena Dudley, who will speak for the second half of the hour. And we will have, if we have a chance, some opportunity for some questions. So please do put your questions in the chat function in the bottom of your Zoom there, and we'll try to address some of those questions during the main webinar time, and the rest of them keep for the breakout rooms. And we will arrange a process of answering those questions even if we don't get a chance to do them on the webinar. So Professor Vanessa Berholt comes to us from the School of Nursing at the University of Auckland, where she's a professor of gerontology. She has previously been the founder and director of the Centre for Innovative Ageing at the College of Human and Health Sciences at Swansea University in Wales, in the UK. She's been the director of the Pan Wales Centre for Ageing and Dementia Research and founder of the Institute of Creative Ageing Industries in Wales. Vanessa's research focuses on older people's attachment to people and places, and she's published on rurality, loneliness, support networks, intergenerational relationships, ethnicity, and migration. So it's with great pleasure that I hand over to Vanessa to talk to us today about connectedness and communications. Thank you, Vanessa.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Sisbury Tamaonga, ko Aaron Te Awa, ko Ngāti Pākehā Te Iwi, ko Carriage Te Whānau, ko Waipapa Te Marae, ko Thomas Gooch Te Tangata, no Worthing England aho, kai Te Raki Pai Whenua Taku Kainga, ko Vanessa Berholt Toku Ingoa. No reira tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. As Nairi kindly introduced me, I'm going to talk to you today about technology-mediated communications in familial relationships and its influence on isolation and loneliness. Next slide, please. I'm going to start by actually explaining what I mean by social isolation and what the definition of loneliness. And I'm going to move on to think about some of the technological innovations and interventions that have actually been tried to alleviate loneliness in the older population. And I'm going to refer to this as an interventionist logic and explain the medical model of later life, which is quite often used in these particular studies. And I want to finish by drawing on some of the research that I've done in the UK, looking at the technology-mediated communications that older people use in everyday life, what their experiences are, and draw on a social model of later life to explain how these influence isolation and loneliness. Next slide, please. So first of all, social isolation, I'm referring to social isolation as a lack of or low levels of meaningful social contact. So these are things with like social relationships with relatives, family members, friends, or neighbours. I'm making a very clear distinction between social isolation and loneliness. There is a correlation between the two, but the two are not synonymous. So someone might be socially isolated, but not lonely. They can be lonely, but not isolated. They may be both lonely and isolated, or neither lonely nor isolated. And in order to explain why this is, we need to understand how we define loneliness. Next slide, please. So I'm describing loneliness as a negative emotional feeling that is the outcome of a mismatch between what we expect in terms of our social relationships and what we can actually achieve. There are various different types of loneliness that are described in the literature, for example, existential loneliness or familial loneliness. But the two most common forms of loneliness that are described are emotional loneliness. So that's the lack of a significant other. And it might be following bereavement, where someone loses a long-term partner or a spouse, that they might experience emotional loneliness. Social loneliness, on the other hand, is the lack of the desired social network. So that much broader range of family, friends, and relatives. Now, the estimates of the prevalence of loneliness vary. This can be because the ways in which we measure loneliness vary. So, for example, there is a self-assessment of loneliness where people are asked to explain how lonely they are, usually over a period of time. But there are some other ways of capturing loneliness that try to avoid mentioning the word lonely. At the outset of this conference, Stephanie Clare from Age Concern talked about trying to reduce that stigma associated with talking about loneliness. But to avoid people, to avoid that stigma, some of these measures of loneliness don't mention loneliness at all. And so they ask people a series of questions, and their answers to those questions are used to assess their level of loneliness without them specifically having to talk about loneliness directly. So those mean that estimates of prevalence vary because we measure it in different ways, but loneliness also varies by country and by age. Next slide, please. So in the UK, around 1/4 of the older population aged 65 and over are lonely at any one time. This bar chart here is from the MSD's General Social Survey, and it shows that around 10% of New Zealanders aged 65 to 74 and 13% of those aged 75 and older identified as feeling lonely all, most, or some of the time in the last 4 weeks. So according to MSD's social report, loneliness was higher for women, for Māori, and for Asians. But you can see that those aged 65 to 74, there were proportionally fewer people experiencing loneliness in this age group than in any other age group. So this is counter really to some of those media representations of the older population, which are often described as lonely and isolated. And in fact, it's a smaller proportion of this age group that are lonely. I'm going to be talking about ICT and TMC. So I need to explain what both of those are and their role in, potentially their role in isolation and loneliness. ICT, information communication technology, covers any product that will store, retrieve, manipulate, or receive information electronically in a digital form. So that includes personal computers, it includes your digital TV, emails, and it even includes robots. Technology-mediated communication, which I'm going to abbreviate to TMC, is a subset of ICT, and this comprises the communications that are controlled and facilitated by technology tools and applications. So examples include telephone conversations, but also internet-based chats, texts and emails, but also video conferencing. It's been accused of a disciplinary divide between science and technology studies and social gerontology. And it's been argued that this prevents academics from properly addressing that relationship between technology and society. Next slide, please. Scientific articles have explored the impact of using TMC on the reduction in loneliness, and these have tended to report on intervention studies that either deliver therapies, provide social support, befriending or friendship groups, or improve the opportunities for social connectiveness. This table here, and I'm aware this might be viewed differently depending on how you're viewing this webinar. I apologise if anyone's trying to see this on a smartphone, because I don't think you'll be able to read it. But I've got a table here about the effectiveness of loneliness tech interventions. What I've done is taken this from a systematic review by Massey et al. On loneliness interventions. This systematic review covered all ages and all types of interventions. And what I've tried to do here is extract the data for technology interventions and specifically for older people. I've also added an extra couple of studies that were published more recently that were technological interventions that were about decreasing loneliness. So the table shows the authors, the sample, the type of study, and these are described as those that provide therapy, social support, or social access. And in the last column, whether or not the studies demonstrated any effect on loneliness. So I'll just describe a few of these for you from each of those groups that I've explained. So the first one listed here is by Dodge and colleagues. This was a study with 83 older people in retirement communities and senior centres in Portland in the USA. And the study delivered some cognitive-based stimulation therapy, which comprised of face-to-face conversations with older people 5 days a week for 6 weeks by video chat. And you can see that actually had no effect on the loneliness of the people involved in that particular intervention. Other types of interventions comprised of social support. So a very early study by Evans and colleagues in 1982 with 84 older people who were registered blind, conducted in Washington in the USA, comprised of calls to older participants to provide information about resources and problems they might be facing. And this study did have an impact on loneliness. But if we look at a similar study that was conducted in 2006 with older people with HIV and AIDS and depression that comprised 12 weekly 90-minute telephone calls by Heckman and Barkowski. This also emphasised coping strategies to reduce psychological distress, but didn't have an effect on loneliness. And finally, the social access interventions were ones that tried to improve people's opportunities to connect to others using TMC. Shapira and Barak in 2007 worked with 22 Israelis who lived in the community and nursing homes, and they provided computers in those nursing homes or in day centres that the older Israelis were visiting. They provided some training to use the computers, and then in between training sessions encouraged older people to use them to connect to other people. And this study did have an impact on loneliness. But a very similar study in 2007 by Tina Fokkema and Kees Nipsheer in the Netherlands with 30 older adults who lived alone and didn't have any computer access, but were given computers and printers and monitors for 3 years. They were provided with lessons at home and also continued support through home volunteer visits to increase their opportunities for social opportunities through the PC. That had no influence on loneliness. These studies suggest that in general, the science and technology studies have favoured a medical or deficit model of aging, in which older people are often portrayed using negative stereotypes, for example, as living with disabilities, in poor health, isolated and lonely. And this lends itself to the interventionist logic, where ICT is seen as a solution to solve a particular challenge associated with aging. So other ICT projects, for example, look at compensating for poor dexterity, mobility, or cognitive function, or delivering healthcare solutions. In these particular cases, though, it's about promoting social connection. But the medical model of aging contributes to aging and often incorrect assumptions about older populations. And we've seen some of that highlighted in the recent COVID-19 epidemic. Consequently, it's frequently contested by social gerontologists, and we tend to highlight how that decline narrative can contribute to social structural constraints in the lives of older people. One of the other things about the technological interventionist approach is that the populations that have been chosen in these studies are very specific. So they might be a retirement community, or for example, a population of blind people. They're also particularly small studies. And the generally insignificant effect on loneliness suggests that the interventionist logic and these deficit models of aging need to be challenged. And we need to really understand why, how, and when TMC impacts on loneliness for older people. And I want to think of TMC as a stepping stone. So it might be instrumental in achieving social contact for older people, but it might be a stepping stone to that longer term goal of avoiding feelings of loneliness. However, this assumption is not necessarily backed up by any or grounded on evidence, because there are very few studies that have looked at that emotional equivalence of TMC to supplement or as a substitute for face-to-face contact between people. Although many of the studies that are cited in this table are obviously based on that assumption that if we improve or provide more opportunities for social contact through TMC, then individual loneliness will be decreased. Next slide, please. What I want to do for the rest of the study then, rest of the presentation, is actually to look at a study that we conducted in Wales. I'm sorry, it's not in New Zealand, but this was one of the studies I've been involved in. It was part of a 5-centre epidemiological study called CFAS. The Welsh arm was CFAS Wales 2. And we drew participants from 2 areas of Wales. You can see to the left of the diagram, Gwynedd and Ynys Môn in North Wales and Neath Port Talbot in South Wales. We did baseline interviews with older people aged 65 and over, and 2-year follow-up interviews. We had a survey, so we collected quantitative data, but we also did 2 waves of qualitative sub-studies. In 2012 to 2014, we interviewed 3,500 older people, and these were followed up in our wave 2 interviews with around 2,200 people that we could follow up. Next slide, please. So we were particularly interested in a social model of loneliness, but first I want to point out how many people in this study, and I'm drawing on the second wave of data here. We didn't ask about TMC in the first wave of data collection. In our second wave of data, we collected information on how frequently people were using TMC. The darkest bars at the top of the bar charts represent those people who use the TMC less often than monthly or never. So we can see that the phone was, unsurprisingly, the most frequent form of TMC that were used by older people. Only around 1/10 of the population used the phone less than monthly or never. And text and email were used next most frequently. Around 61% of our participants used text or email less often than monthly or never. And video calls were used fairly infrequently. About 87% of the sample used video calls less often than monthly or never. Next slide, please. So the presentation now is really based on a social model of loneliness. And in this model, there are particular risks or reasons why people can't achieve or maintain the social relationships they want. These risk factors include certain personal attributes. They might include biological and neurological risks. So, for example, cognitive or functional impairment can impact on how people can maintain or develop social relations, which then impact on loneliness if there is a mismatch between what one desires and what one can achieve. There are also certain life events that are considered risks for loneliness. These include retirement. So on retirement, you may substantially reduce the group of colleagues that you've been used to being in contact with every day. And also on socioeconomic status or exclusion from material resources means that people may not be able to participate in the same spaces where those social interactions occur if they can't afford to, or may not be able to afford the travel that is required to maintain social relationships that have already been formed. Today, I'm particularly interested in the effect of migration. Now, migration might be of an older person away from a place where their networks were to a new place where they've got to form new networks, or it might be the migration of friends and family away from an older person. The result is that a person may live at distance from their friends and family. And today I'm particularly interested in the effect of migration and the effect of living at a distance from the nearest family member on how one maintains social relationships and the impact on loneliness. Next slide, please. So we proposed that those people who live 50 miles away from their nearest relatives are more likely to experience isolation and more likely to experience loneliness. However, this particular relationship is mediated, so it's accounted for in a different way. If you live more than 50 miles away from your nearest relative, you've got to invest a particular amount of energy in maintaining those relationships. So face-to-face contact is likely to be reduced. And in our study, we found that this was the case. So people who lived further than 50 miles away from the nearest relative had lower levels of face-to-face contact. And this in turn increased levels of isolation and increased levels of loneliness. So the relationship between living at a distance from a family member and greater levels of loneliness and greater levels of social isolation was at least partly accounted for by these lower levels of face-to-face contact. Next slide, please. So we wanted to investigate whether technology-mediated communication was able to diminish that effect of lower levels of face-to-face contact on isolation and lower levels of face-to-face contact on loneliness. Could they be substituted for that face-to-face contact and diminish that relationship between the two variables? And we're particularly interested in the telephone calls. That's the first icon. The second one is text and emails, and the third icon representing video calls. And we tested this with two different outcomes. So the effect on isolation and the effect on loneliness separately. Next slide, please. So what we found was that telephone calls did diminish the influence of lower levels of face-to-face contact on social isolation, and so did text and emails. But video calls had no effect. It didn't diminish that relationship between lower levels of face-to-face contact and social isolation. We took the same approach to look at the influence of TMC on loneliness. Next slide, please. And we found a different effect for TMC. In this case, telephone calls didn't diminish the influence of face-to-face contact on loneliness, nor did text or emails, and neither did video calls. So none of the forms of TMC for our whole sample had an effect on loneliness. We did wonder whether there were going to be differences between different age cohorts of older people. Younger older people were more, so those under 75, were more likely to have used computers in the workplace than those over 75, and therefore might be more familiar with using new technologies such as text and email or video calls. So we split our sample into two halves and we reran this analysis to see if we could observe any differences between younger old and older old. We found exactly the same relationships for social isolation. So telephone and text and emails did have effect on diminishing the influence of face-to-face contact on loneliness. But we found one difference for loneliness. Next slide, please. In this case, for the younger cohort, telephone calls diminished the influence of face-to-face contact on loneliness, but there were no other differences observed. This doesn't really explain what's happening with people's use of telephone calls and texting and emailing and video calls. So we moved on to look at our qualitative data from our in-depth interviews with older people to explore how they use these in practice and what they felt about using these technologies. Next slide, please. So drawing on some of these, the in-depth interviews, we'll find that actually the ways people use text and emails and video calls will probably come as no surprise because it's the way that most of us use these things. So after the phone, text and emailing was the most commonly cited form of TMC used, and its main use was to keep in touch and up to date with family members and close friends. Mrs. D said, I've got one or two friends with you know, anytime happens in my life, I usually send them a text or something. We text each other non-stop. She was texting me as I was on the ferry saying, have a good journey. In comparison with the phone, text was seen as particularly beneficial when wishing to pass on information or to communicate someone who's likely to be traveling or otherwise unable to speak on the phone. So Mrs. C, talking about her son, said, he's either in an office or in the car, isn't he? So I send him a text and then he phones me back. Texting was also advantageous and emailing where more complicated communications were involved or a very quick message wanted to be sent. So one of our participants, it said, I just text a picture of coffee and my sister knows I'm there. That was in the cafe. She'll come down, we'll meet up for half an hour. If it's anything a bit more complicated, it will probably be an email. Like one friend, we were supposed to be going out for a meal and she sent me the menu. So other benefits of texting and emails were the cost effectiveness. And this particularly came into play when people had long distance relationships, as it was more cost effective than using the phone. So although texting was seen as particularly speedy and particularly helpful when a quick message needed to be sent, some people found that email communication could be quite onerous, given the lengths of some emails and that perception that a reply is often expected quite quickly. Mrs. K said, sometimes I think it's intrusive and I feel, gosh, you know, I've got to reply and I don't seem to have the time. Texting didn't appear to replace face-to-face contact as people sent and received texts as well as visiting and seeing people living nearby and frequently seen. So one person said, I had a text off her friend, maybe Wednesday or Thursday, but I'll see her today. Although email was used in a similar way to texting, it was also more likely to be used to keep in touch with family and friends who lived at quite some distance. So, for example, participants were in contact with siblings and cousins who lived overseas. And one man talked about contacting his colleagues he used to work with before he retired and moved. And he said, funny thing was, last night I spent an hour going through emails. They were colleagues that I knew years ago and they still keep in touch work-wise. So they just send an email. What are you doing now? Next slide, please. So video calls were used less frequently by a minority of our participants, and they could be divided into three user groups, really: occasional, regular, and frequent users. Occasional users of video calls refer to its benefits for bringing people together at particular events, so special events like Christmas, birthdays, or other special occasions. Mrs. W said, we all get together on Boxing Day and we were up at my son's house and they put my grandson on Skype and he came through to us and he spoke to all of us then. Regular users of video call also saw it particularly useful to keep in touch with families, either temporarily or permanently living at a distance. Mrs. G said, I speak on the phone with my sister twice a week, but I was on Skype with her, but she was further away then. She'd gone to Australia, but she's back now. And a small number of older participants used video calls routinely, and that was regardless of how far away they lived from family members. And this case, it would seem to benefit, it was the benefit of virtual face-to-face contact that they emphasised. So Mr. A said, I've got used to Skype. It's nice to actually see my granddaughter and she can see me, you know. And there's no sort of set rules on it at all. And we just occasionally decide it would be a good idea to Skype one another. And we do, yeah. Routine use of video calls doesn't seem to reduce the frequency of phone calls. Mr. H said, me and my brother phone about once a week, unless we've got something else to ask, and then it can be even more, and we Skype as well. So it's been suggested that the main benefit of using video calls over and above phone calls or texting and emails is to feel more in touch, in present touch than other forms of communication. To that extent, we would have expected our quantitative analysis to have compensated for that lack of face-to-face contact in terms of our outcomes, which we didn't find. However, some of the interviews with our participants suggested that they did feel like that. Mrs. G said, all the time we're Skyping, and she was talking about herself and her son, I just feel we're in touch. It's silly, isn't it? But other participants didn't view video calls as having that same quality as face-to-face contact. We asked a question as whether people saw less of people over the last year. And one of our participants replied, well, I suppose when you see them on Skype, you are seeing them, yes. However, the way she responded suggested that she wasn't convinced that the face-to-face contact and video calls had the same qualities at all. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, we saw that telephone calls, text and emails were used as a substitute or to supplement in-person contact, and they reduced the influence of face-to-face contact on social isolation for older people in both of our age cohorts. But in the whole sample, none of the TMC had emotional equivalence to face-to-face contact. In other words, although it increased social contact, it didn't meet up with those expectations about social relationships. If you remember that definition of loneliness, it's a mismatch between the achieved levels of social contact and what we expect in our social relations. So for the whole sample, those forms of TMC didn't have emotional equivalence to face-to-face contact. But what we could interpret from the differences we saw in the age cohorts, where we saw that telephone contact did have an influence on loneliness, there may be that normative lag between the functional and emotional equivalence. So in other words, we're using these forms of TMC in our day-to-day contacts with older people. In the younger cohorts, those have become part of the expectations for contact. The ways in which they envisage their social relationships included telephone calls, and the more frequent telephone calls reduced loneliness. And we might expect future cohorts to actually incorporate TMC into their expectations for social relationships, so that in the future, those forms of communication might influence loneliness. But certainly for our older cohorts at the moment, they don't have an impact. They don't form part of the expectations about how we maintain and develop our social relationships. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Vanessa, Professor Berholt. What a fascinating presentation. And isn't it interesting how if we would do that same survey now after our post-COVID time, where we know that patterns of use of both video and telephone communications may have changed. We've had some great stuff on the chat if people want to have a look. Comments about the during the lockdown, DPANS, which is Disabled Persons Assembly, was facilitated to use much more telecommunications. and churches using Zoom as to complement usual activities also appeared to alleviate some problems. So have a look at the chat there. And I'll just leave you with a question, Vanessa, and then we'll go on to Makarena's. So thinking about now that we are in a world full of COVID, not so much in New Zealand, but definitely around the rest of the world, how can we make sure that we're ready for this through our aging demographic, through facilitating the technology communications that we can have? Do you want to just give us a quick comment about that, and then we'll carry on?
Undoubtedly, there is a digital divide for some older people, and we need to support people's use of technology for those who aren't able to use it. But I think we've got to be very careful that even we've had a fairly short period of COVID, people may have got used to social contact and using TMC to contact each other, but it still may not have moved into our expectations about that's how we do this long term, that meets our needs for social relationships. So I'm sure it will reduce isolation. I'm still not convinced that it will reduce isolation for older people, reduce loneliness, because it's not part of our expectations.
And that clear association between loneliness and face-to-face contact is something that's really important from your research. So thank you very much, Vanessa. This webinar will be available, I'm not quite sure exactly how, but it will be available afterwards if people want to review that or catch up with that if they've missed. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Makarena Dudley. Makarena is a clinical neuropsychologist and senior lecturer at the University of Auckland. She's involved in a number of research projects investigating Māori and mati wariwari. And mati wariwari is the te reo term for dementia, including the development of Māori theory of mati wariwari, a dementia diagnostic tool for Māori called the Mana tool, and cognitive stimulation therapy adaptation for Māori, and in development of an app to assist people Māori with dementia. So I'm going to hand over to Makarena to talk to us about the research that she's doing. Welcome, Makarena.
Kia ora, Nairi. E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā kārangaranga maha, tēnā koutou, tēnā hoki tātou katoa. Ko te raroa te Aotearoa, me Ngāti Kahunga iwi, ko ora whana te maunga, ko rangihiki te awa, ko manukau tuku marae, ko Makarena Dudley tuku ingoa. Kia ora, everybody. I'm going to be talking about just one of the projects that I'm involved in at the moment that Nairi just mentioned. And that is the development of a tool to detect dementia, or as Nairi pointed out, in te reo, we call it mati wariwari. So I'm going to, can I share my screen? Have you given me that?
There we go. Yes, you've started sharing your screen. Yep.
So we're going to go to, okay. So my discipline is that I'm a neuropsychologist, and for many, many years now, I've been becoming more and more concerned about the lack of cultural appropriateness in a lot of the psychometric tests that are imported into this country and administered to Māori. And in this particular case, this seems to be the situation in terms of people who are being diagnosed for mate wariwari, for dementia. So in the Lilac study, which Nairi leads, of course, looking at the well-being of elderly New Zealanders, some elderly Māori were found to been from suffering from cognitive impairment or problems with thinking and memory, according to their scores on the modified mini mental state exam. And of course, when the clinician met with these particular kaumata, they in fact didn't have any impairment and were functioning very well. Thank you very much. So it was clear that there were problems with the tool. The MMSE does not take into account the various cultural variabilities that may impact on the performance of the kaumata, including the education levels of the kaumata, some of whom had little to no cultural formal education background at all. So all that impacts on the score or the outcome or the performance of the person who the test has been performed upon. So we applied for funding and were successful with the Health Research Council of New Zealand, who granted us quite a large sum of money. So we've called the study Kaumata Tanga Aotearoa, or the Aging Brain. And the two aims of this study are to write a Māori theory of dementia, and we have already published in the New Zealand Medical Journal, and we have another publication coming out, hopefully, well, it's a bit late for this year, it might not make this year, but certainly early in the next year, regarding the a Māori theory of dementia in terms of the experience and understandings of dementia from a Māori perspective. And of course, the other aim is to develop a Māori friendly diagnostic tool. And I emphasize the Māori friendly because although, of course, the validity of the tool is of the utmost importance, to me, as a neuropsychologist over the years, became very concerned about the experience of Māori and during the process of being assessed, because of the unfamiliar content of the tools, the unfamiliar way in which it was, unfamiliar way in which they were being administered, and so on. So the whole context of assessment was unfamiliar to a lot of the people that I've assessed, and quite frightening, not quite frightening, not only to Māori, but to a lot of people who undergo this type of assessment. So, so what I did was I wanted to pull together a team that was made up of Māori named investigators. So the reason is because my philosophy is that Māori should be doing and conducting research on Māori. And so, we pulled together these named investigators. We have a considerable group of cultural consultants who have had a huge input into the development of both the theory and the diagnostic tool. But of course, we have also a group of non-Māori specialists who have been involved in the research right from day one. And of course, we wanted to make this tool a product of knowledge from the Māori world, as well as the knowledge from the Western, scientific world. And so Lynette, Gary, Sarah, and Nari have all been integral to the development of the tools in particular. So we began conducting hui or focus groups around the country. We wanted this all of this research to be a bottom-up approach. So we wanted it to come from the kaumata, or anything that we produced, to be that of the work or a product of the narrative of the kaumata. So we travelled the country to Kaitaia, Auckland, Hamilton, Taranaki, Whakatane, Wellington, and Christchurch, and held hui. We interviewed approximately 230 kaumata altogether. We held semi-structured group interviews. So, and we asked, and the overarching question was, what are your experiences or understandings of mate wareware, or of dementia? So there were about 8 themes that were identified from the data. Just a moment, I'll just move this so I can read. Yes, so there were 8 themes identified from the data, and what we did was each one of us Māori named investigators went away with a copy of the transcripts, highlighting what we thought was important in terms of a theme, or what would fit into a theme. And then we came back together and we spent hours and hours and hours sort of bringing our ideas together and finally coming up with about 8 major themes that we have written about in our paper in the New Zealand Medical Journal, which I think, no, I have got a citation on one of the slides coming up. So this is just a photo taken of us at the end of the first or second year of the study. We are about to go into the 5th year. It's been elongated, as many research studies are, because of the limitations placed on us by COVID. So yes, we started off in Kaitaia because that's where I hail from. We had originally, prior to this meeting, we went up there and got permission. We asked the kaumata there if it was okay with them that we conduct that study, conduct this type of research, and they were actually incredibly positive and excited about it and keen for us to have it. So we went up there, and this is the average size group that we encountered throughout the country, although some groups were even much larger than this. And so we had to be flexible on the day and think about how we were going to interview large numbers of kaumata who turned up because of the interest that was held by them for this particular kaupapa. So I've highlighted a few of the main findings for the purpose of this kōrero, this talk. First and foremost, there was an overwhelming sense from kaumata at every site that there is a lack of information about mate wari, about dementia. And this made a lot of our kaumata, this made them a lot of them afraid and scared because of the unknown. So they don't have that information about dementia, which I find absolutely tragic. And we had to reassure a number of our kaumata that dementia was not a normal part of aging, that in fact most of them won't get dementia, because quite a few of them said they were just sitting there waiting for the dementia to happen to them, because they'd seen it happen to their other members of their whānau or to their friends or whatever. So there's a huge lack of information out there, and I think that's something that we all need to address in our own way. There was an overwhelming sense of not liking the words dementia or Alzheimer's. I don't think this particularly only applies to Māori, to be honest. I don't think anybody likes the stigma that is associated with these particular terms. So we asked for alternative words that we could use. There were a variety of words that came up, depending on what part of the country we were in, depending on the vernacular of the local iwi, or the mita, as we call it, of the local iwi. So there were words such as pōrangi, rori, rangirua, wairua, wairangi, sorry, a whole range of different terminology or words that were used. But the word, the term mate wari was the most universally used term for dementia. So mate means to be sick or unwell, and wari means to forget or forgotten. So we in the team, and everybody I talk to now, everybody who is associated with me, usually use the term mate wari rather than the term dementia. I'd like it to become a term that that is in common use when referring to this disease, particularly with Māori. So we got a clear message from the kaumata that wairua was the central and unifying factor which emerged from the kōrero, or from the narratives of the kaumata. They made us promise, actually, that whatever the work was that we did, that we considered the wairua of this whole journey. And so we have acted on that, because, what we wanted to do was we wanted to honour the kōrero, as we all do as researchers. We wanted to honour the narrative of the kaumata and the messages they were giving us, and really the guidance and direction that they were giving us. So I will show you shortly how we in fact have honoured this particular plea from our kaumātua. Living and functioning in the te ao Māori world was critical for te oranga wairua of the person with mati wareware and their family and their whānau. And so essentially what this meant was, if we can provide knowledge about how a person can really claim their identity as Māori, if they might be somewhat disconnected from it, then how do we sort of steer them back to that place, and how do we optimize cultural identity in terms of the well-being of that person and their whānau? And because we all acknowledge that our Māori identity is central to our well-being, and so that has become a really important platform in terms of us making recommendations for living a better life and for possibly slowing down the progress of mati wareware. Oh, here is the paper that I've mentioned that we have already published, and so you can go to that, and it's quite an interesting read, so I've been told by quite a number of people. At each of our hui, at the end, so we would be hosted for the day, and it was quite interesting because, as some of you will know, manaakitanga is very important in the Māori world. So it was interesting, each site that we went to, and often they were on marae, they were probably, I suspect, trying to outdo the previous site that we'd been to in terms of their hospitality. In Whakatane, they were particularly wonderfully hospitable to us. But anyway, at the end of each session, towards the end of the day, just before we would leave, what we did was we presented a session, our psychiatrist presented a session. In this case, this is Oliver Menzies here, talking to the whānau, talking to the kaumātua. He's a geriatrician, a Māori geriatrician, and he was talking to the whānau about dementia, and obviously from a Western perspective. We did that because in response to the plead from kaumātua that they wanted to know more about it, about mati wareware. So we left the session towards the end of our visit because we didn't want to contaminate their understandings and their experiences and their narratives around mati wareware. So that was kind of one way that we gave back, if you like. So now we come to, so we've written somewhat on the theory of Māori theory of dementia, and as I said, we are publishing again. So this is the second aim of the study, and this is the development of a tool to detect mati wareware in tangata whenua. And so we were sitting there one day at the team, and we were wondering what we should call it. And Professor Denise Wilson on the team just said, well, why don't we use it? Why don't we call it Māori Assessment of Neuropsychological Abilities? And just coincidentally, an acronym for that is obviously MANA. And you all know that a lot of the tools that are used for this type of assessment do have acronyms. And so we do refer to it as the MANA tool. And for the Māori Assessment of Neuropsychological Abilities. And it's for the detection of mati wareware in tangata whenua. So there are three components to this tool. And so this is, I mentioned earlier, I would tell you how we address the wairua, the plea from, the plea from the kaumātua, that we incorporated wairua into our work, into whatever we produced. So I guess, so there are three components, and the wairua component is unique to this assessment tool in that I think it makes us stand alone. It enables us to stand alone from any other tool that is used to assess dementia probably in the world. And then we have a cognitive component, and then we have a functional component. So this is what the front page of the mana tool looks like. Can you see that? Nari, can you see that? Is that clear?
Yes, yes, we can see that. It's nice and clear.
Okay,
yep.
So at the top, you know, the name, date of birth, blah, blah, blah. Now, so what we've done is, if there are, we've used Māori-friendly words, or we've made it a Māori-friendly tool, and one way we've done that is to include Māori words. So where there is a Māori word in the question, such as if a person is saying, if the assessor is asking, how is your, what is your role within your whānau? The word whānau is spelt phonetically, is included, is written phonetically in brackets immediately after that, the word whānau, and then the meaning of the word whānau, so i.e. family is given immediately after the phonetic pronunciation of it. And that's really to help clinicians who are relatively new to our country and don't understand our reo. So we're actually providing a little te reo lesson as well. So it was very important. So going back to the name of the tool and using these words, it was very important, and particularly in the naming of the tool, that we found a name that non-Māori clinicians would be comfortable saying. That's why I liked the Māori assessment of neuropsych abilities, the mana tool, because we thought if they can't pronounce the word, if we give it a Māori name, which we were really tempted to, but we thought a lot of non-Māori clinicians, if they can't pronounce the name, they're less likely to use it. That was our thinking. The name that we've come up with, I think, is ideal. And so once again, that is the rationale behind, providing a phonetic pronunciation of any Māori words that might be in there. Just want to move this. So as you can see, here are two examples of the word wairua spelt phonetically and the meaning. And then down in question 9, the word whānau, how that once again phonetically pronounced and the meaning of it. So all in all, I'm trying to think how many questions. I think there are 19 questions in the oranga kaumātua, the wairua wellbeing component. So the rationale behind this is because we wanted to, as I said, we wanted to respond to the requests of the kaumātua, but we also feel that if the clinician gets an idea of how the kaumātua or the person that they're assessing, how they are coping within their wairua, then that's going to impact on their overall well-being, on their overall level of coping. It's integral to a lot of to kaumātua and how they exist and how they are functioning in the real world. So it obviously it helps develop rapport. And in fact, when I presented this tool the other day out at Middlemore Hospital, one GP came to me and said she would quite like to use that component in her, in her consultations. So without, as a standalone sort of component. So it's about developing rapport, but it's really getting to the essence of where that kaumātua might be in terms of their spiritual well-being. So it is entering into that spiritual realm, which is so incredibly important. I can't underestimate, I can't over-exaggerate how important it is to kaumātua, that aspect or that realm of spirituality of wairua. So the functional tool is comprised of 32 questions, I think thereabouts. So what we did in order to develop the functional component and the cognitive component is that we looked at all the tools that are currently used in Aotearoa We identified all the domains that need evaluating in terms of looking for dementia or mate wareware. So we looked at the CAMCOG, at the MMSE, the MOCA, the ACE3, the RUDAS, the SO, or pretty much every tool that is used in this country, and for as well as the Blessed and the IQ code and the functional activities questionnaire and so on and so forth. All those tools we brought together, looked at the domains, then looked at the weighting of each domain in each tool, and using that, we came up with the tools that we have here, the functional tool and the cognitive tool. In order to form the questions with these, we identify those domains in the narratives of the kaumātua, so that we fashion the questions so that they were similar to that narrative within the data. So in that sense, again, it really emphasizes a bottom-up approach, and that this is very much, we like to think, a product of the interviews that we held with our kaumātua. This is the cognitive assessment tool. I'm trying to move this out of the way. Anyway, this is the cognitive assessment tool, and we have made some changes in order to make it Māori friendly. As I said right at the beginning, it's really about making the experience of the assessment more friendly for our kaumātua. So as a lot of you probably know, in the MMSE, the interviewee is asked to spell the word world backward. So we've just incorporated Māori words, so that, you know, what we are trying to encourage is that sense of inclusiveness, that sense of belonging, that sense that, yes, we are in New Zealand. This is a tool that's obviously been developed in New Zealand, Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's not a tool that's been imported from the UK or from the US, as they all are. And so it really, you know, it just sets a really good scene for that person, hopefully, to do well. I did a study quite a few years ago that we did exactly this sort of thing on the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, and we changed some of the content to have Māori content in there. And there were young guys aged 20 to 30 who were our sample group. And when they saw Māori content in there, their reaction was just really wonderful. They were so pleased and excited to see that. And so what you're doing is you are developing, or you're encouraging them to be engaged in the process, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to get the best performance out of these people. So this is one way I think that we can do that. So here's another way that we've done it. As you know, there are pictures of elephants and lions and all sorts of other things in the other tools. In this tool, we have incorporated pictures that are familiar to Māori and hopefully familiar to all New Zealanders. We have, excuse me, we have worked on scoring criteria because, for example, so as not to disadvantage some of the answers that might come out. So, for example, the first picture is obviously a picture most people would say marae, but people can also say wharenui, they can say whare tangata, they can say whare tapu. There's a range of correct answers. So we've made sure that our scoring criteria incorporates all of those variations of correct responses. And this really, this was something that I was particularly keen to do, because a colleague of mine did a study 20 years ago on the waste battery of tests at that time. And in the vocabulary sub-test, the Māori guys in his sample were asked what was the meaning of the word domestic. And these guys said, responded and said, well, that's a fight usually between a guy and his missus. And that was their response. And they were marked wrong because it wasn't in the scoring criteria of the waste manual. But in actual fact, those answers are not wrong. they are right, in that person's world, they were correct. Another example was they were asked, what was the meaning of the word terminate? And their response was to kill somebody, to do away with somebody. And once again, they were marked wrong. And once again, they were not wrong. So scoring criteria to me is really important in terms of, you know, the final score that you are achieving. Is it accurate? And that's what that's the rationale behind my insistence on the scoring criteria being comprehensive and inclusive of all those various terms. So we have just started the pilot and validation of the mana tool. So we are looking at around 100 people to sample it on. The first 10 will be the pilot. So we're going to be getting a lot of feedback from the first 10 that we administer, and we will be tweaking the tool accordingly. We are working out of Te Tai Tukaro, Tamaki Makaurau, in Hamilton, Rotorua, and I'm just thinking we should probably go to Ngāi Tahu, to the South Island as well. So 90 is not a lot, but we do have a time frame, and I don't know if I've got. Oh yes, we do have a time frame because we, as some of you all know, the health of older people and the DHBs have been asked to produce an alternative to the MOCA, given that it's going out of use in December, or it has to be paid for, and they have come up with the mini ACE, which has been accepted by the health of older people, and they've also endorsed the dissemination and integration of the alternate kaupapa Māori screening tool when available, and that is our tool, the mana tool. So there is we do have a time frame now. So we want to get it completed, piloted and validated by the end of next year, analysed and ready at the end of next year, or ready at the beginning of 2022 for uptake in the DHBs, and hopefully for anybody who is looking at diagnosing or screening for mate wareware. The cognitive tool as such, as it sits right now, is too long for a screening tool. There are 18 questions and probably takes about half an hour to administer. So as a screening tool, that's not appropriate. What we will be doing is we will be looking at developing a smaller version of the cognitive component, and it will be called the mana iti. Iti meaning small in Māori. So that's the end of my kōrero. We want to mihi to all the kaumata, of course, who have taken part in our research, and I particularly want to acknowledge and pay my respects to our kaumātua Piripi Daniels, who was really, and I'm really apologise, I don't have a photo of him up here, and I mistakenly took it out. But Piripi was an integral part of our study. He contributed enormously. He accompanied us on virtually every trip we had away to conduct focus groups. He was he had a lot of input in terms of the analysing of the data, and he passed away in July of this year, unfortunately. So he is hugely missed, but and I also want to acknowledge all those other koe and kaumātua who have passed away since we began this research. So I think that's me. I hope I have gone long enough, but anyway, thank you very much. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Kia ora, Makarena, what a fantastic talk, and there's quite a lot of tautoko to this mahi on the chat, so have a look there. People are very much awaiting the mana tool, and it will have a huge impact on our ability to more appropriately assess cognition for older people. Makarena, just one question before we go into our breakout rooms. So thinking about mati wareware, it isn't just an issue for individuals, but for whānau and iwi and communities. How
Yes.
do you think that we can help those communities get ready? Because we will be having a greater proportion of people in the older age groups amongst Māori. And so therefore there will be, an increase in the number of people with dementia. Have you got
Yes.
any perspectives for us?
Well, I think, first and foremost, we've got to start with educating our whānau and informing our whānau what this disease is all about. There are some thoughts out there that it's a spiritual journey that and it's seen as a positive experience, but as a lot of us know, that's not the case. So I think first and foremost, we've got to educate our people. We've got to get out there. We've got to get the message out there to them about the implications and what mati wareware really is. And to that cause, to that end, we have started developing a phone app, which will provide a lot of information to whānau. It's a Māori-friendly phone app, which we hope to launch in November. So that's one way of doing it. I think the other way is probably to actually go out and visit areas, visit marae, do roadshows, but somehow we've got to get the message out there that this is a disease that's going to be more and more prevalent in our Māori communities, and you need to know about it. So, and of course, given that Māori probably look after we know that they look after their kaumātua at home for longer than non-Māori, there is probably a need for more resources to be channeled towards our whānau to help them, take care and really lower the burden of caregiving on the whānau, and whānau who are already extremely pushed in terms of resources.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Kia ora. Thank you for that, Makarena. And so I just want to extend a big thanks for your presentation. What a great lineup we've had this morning. And now we will have given opportunity for people to gather together in breakout rooms. There'll be 4 breakout rooms. So in the next few moments, they'll open up and you'll be invited to join. Please do if you would like to. I just want to acknowledge our sponsor again, Ryman Healthcare, and all of the other conference sponsors. These presentations will be available on the Age Concern New Zealand YouTube webpage. So if you look at the Age Concern New Zealand website, you'll be able to find them. Now, in the breakout rooms, I will ask you to just put your cameras on so you can see each other and unmute, and please participate in the discussion. There'll be one facilitator who will run over the rules of engagement and invite you to have a discussion about both the presentations. I think if you think about those 2 questions we had, how can we make sure that older people and loneliness through the COVID restrictions can be helped with technologies for communication, and then for the mati wareware tool, which is coming, how can we help communities to be ready for an increased number of people? Okay, so we'll give you about 20 minutes to have discussions and then just come back together at the end for a final farewell. Thank you very much again to Vanessa and Makarena for leading us off today. Hello, everybody. Just waiting for the last few seconds for the breakout rooms to close fully and for everyone to pop back into the main room. I had a very interesting discussion in my breakout room. We got onto ageing policy and the election, which is upcoming. Everybody from New Zealand has got to vote. Even those overseas who are allowed to should definitely vote. There wasn't much discussion about ageing policy in this election. I was very disappointed in that. I've been trying to ask, key questions to wherever I possibly can, and not getting much traction. But next election, I know, will be even further into our wonderful ageing transition. And so, of course, it will be key policy, important things.
Nairi?
Yes, Makarena.
How do you, I've gone into the chat room, and to answer them, I can't. I don't know where to go to give an answer. Can you answer after each question?
Not after each question, but just at the
okay.
bottom. If you just
Yeah,
put
yeah,
a
I got it.
message, Macarena, to everybody, those who
Yeah,
are
okay.
who are looking at the chat. And the
Okay.
chat, I'm not sure what happens to the chat after the oh, hello, I've been spotlighted. Hello, everybody. So I've got a question here for Kyrie. So Kyrie, with the chat, does the chat go alongside the video in the YouTube, or do we just see a video of the presentations?
You can get.
Kyrie will have to unmute himself to answer that. Maybe. Anyway, I will try to send out I'll send out messages as to how we can address the chat, but in the meantime, Macarena, you can just answer it by a message at the bottom.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah. Okay, so yes, it's Nairi Curse here again. I'm the president of the New Zealand Association of Gerontology, and wanted to thank you all very much for participating in our co-hosted event, New Zealand Association for Gerontology and Age Concern New Zealand. This is in anticipation of a fantastic face-to-face conference next year. So we had very wonderful presentations from Professor Vanessa Berholt and Dr. Macarena Dudley. And so those will be available on the YouTube channel through the Age Concern New Zealand website. Have a look there. I wanted to thank our speakers very much. What a fantastic lineup we had today. Very stimulating, very relevant, very important presentations going forward. Again, I wanted to thank our sponsors. We've got Ryman Healthcare there, and the other ones on the slide, Perpetual Guardian, Aging Well New Zealand, the Selwyn Institute. This is part of a series of webinars. And so the next two webinars, next Thursday at the same time, that's Thursday, the October 22nd, from 10 a.m. New Zealand time to 12 p.m. to 12 midday, we have a panel session, Taking a Breath, Reflections on COVID-19. John Parsons will be the facilitator for that panel, with Dr. Judy Breakley, our own Dr. Ashley Bloomfield, Murray Elridge, and Simon Wallace. So that will be a very stimulating panel discussion about reflecting on COVID-19. And then October the 29th, please spread the word to all the students who may be associated or interested in gerontology. There's a Meet the Academic session webinar led by Professor Deborah Walters and Associate Professor Andy Towers. And so that's been organised by Rosie Gibson from Massey University, and that will be a great time to get together to listen to those people. Now, on our backdrop now is all of the other sponsors for the conference, the Vision for Aging conference. So I want to thank all of those sponsors very much for supporting us. And we will get there to have our face-to-face conference. But at this point, I'll close the webinar and say thank you very much for being with us today. And let's all carry on in our important work and our interest in aging, and look out for all the older people in New Zealand and overseas. So thank you very much. Bye for now.